Gunfire cracked through the trees like splitting timber, each shot echoing too close for comfort as boots churned through mud thick with rain and blood. The air reeked of smoke, oil, and fear, and somewhere behind the chaos a radio screamed static before falling silent. She stumbled, hit the ground hard, and tasted iron as rough hands seized her shoulders and forced her upright. Voices shouted over one another in a language she barely understood, sharp and urgent, while a rifle pressed firmly against her spine. Her hands rose slowly, her heart pounding so violently it felt like it might give her away. Then the shooting stopped. The battlefield fell into an unnatural quiet, broken only by distant artillery fading into the night. A calmer voice spoke close to her ear, promising safety, promising that it was over. But no one in that moment realized that the promise marked the beginning of something far worse. Because moments after the weapons fell silent and the assurance was given, something happened that would never be written into any official record. It was Western Europe in 1944, as the war collapsed inward and German forces retreated across shattered towns, forests, and frozen roads. Among the scattered units were women serving as medics, radio operators, clerks, and messengers, trained to support the war effort, not to vanish without explanation. According to international law and military doctrine, female soldiers captured by the enemy were to be registered as prisoners of war, protected, documented, and eventually returned home. On paper, their fate was clear. In reality, as front lines dissolved and command structures fractured, something began to go terribly wrong. Transit camps reported women listed as received but never transferred, names entered into logs with no follow-up, no interviews, and no release dates. Families waited months and then years for letters that never arrived, while officials insisted the records were simply incomplete. Whispers spread among survivors of promises made after capture, of safety guaranteed, and of separations that were never explained. What no one understood at the time was that capture itself was not the danger. It was what came afterward, when the war slipped into shadows and the real threat had yet to reveal itself. The moment that changed everything did not arrive with an explosion or a gunshot, but with a message that was never meant to draw attention. Buried inside a routine batch of intercepted transmissions, it appeared ordinary at first glance, short, fragmented, and partially garbled by static. Yet one line stood out, hastily underlined in pencil by a junior intelligence clerk who felt an unease he could not explain. It contained no coordinates, no unit designation, no operational code. Only a woman's name, written as if the recipient already knew exactly who she was. When the message was passed up the chain of command, the reaction was immediate and unsettling. Questions were asked behind closed doors, voices dropped, and within hours, previously standard procedures at the nearby holding site were quietly altered without explanation. That same evening, orders were issued to separate certain female prisoners from the rest of the captured personnel. No formal announcement was made, no justification provided. Guards who had spent weeks processing POWs by the book were suddenly instructed to delay registration, to hold back paperwork, and to move specific women off the official rosters entirely. Some of the prisoners noticed the change before the guards did. They were counted twice, then not at all. Names were spoken in low voices, cross-checked against lists that were quickly folded and hidden away. When one officer questioned why these women were not being logged for transfer, he was told only that the instructions came from higher authority and that the matter was not open for discussion. As night fell, the camp atmosphere shifted from tense to unnatural. Floodlights remained dimmer than usual, and the constant rhythm of roll calls was disrupted. A small group of women was ordered to gather their belongings, nothing more than coats, personal letters, and identification tags, and stand apart from the others. They were told this was a temporary relocation, a routine procedure, nothing to fear. Yet the trucks that arrived carried no insignia, no visible unit markings, and their drivers avoided eye contact. One sentry later recalled that the engines were kept running the entire time, as if there were no intention of staying longer than absolutely necessary. Inside the camp office, a radio operator attempted to log the movement, only to be interrupted by a sharp command to stop transmitting. Moments later, the radio signal cut out entirely, replaced by a low hiss of dead air. A final entry was scribbled into the logbook, incomplete and rushed, noting that the prisoners were being transferred under special orders. The sentence ended abruptly, as though the writer had been called away before finishing the thought. That log would later be found with several pages missing, the carbon copies torn out and never recovered. For the women being moved, confusion turned into dread. They asked where they were going and when they would be registered, clinging to the belief that paperwork meant safety. The answers were vague, delivered without conviction. One woman reportedly noticed that her name had been scratched out on a clipboard and replaced with a symbol she did not recognize. Another heard an officer whisper that this was not part of the standard exchange process. The realization spread quietly among them that whatever was happening was not routine, and that the promise of protection given at capture no longer applied. By the time the trucks disappeared into the darkness, no official record remained of who had been taken or why. The camp returned to its rigid order by morning as if nothing unusual had occurred. Roll calls continued, transfers resumed, but the women who had been separated were never listed as departed, never marked as arrived anywhere else, and never officially declared missing. The message that had started it all was filed away, misclassified, and forgotten, except for the name it contained. And as dawn broke over the camp, it became clear that the next 90 seconds after that message had been decoded had altered the fate of those women forever, determining not only whether they would survive, but whether history would ever acknowledge that they had existed at all. In the days that followed the night transfers, the camp fell into a state of controlled confusion that no one openly acknowledged but everyone felt. Procedures that had once been rigid and predictable began to fracture. Roll calls were repeated, then contradicted. Guard rotations changed without notice. Radios that had worked flawlessly for months now failed at random intervals, their signals swallowed by static at critical moments. Officers argued quietly inside command tents, maps spread across tables as if answers could be found in ink and grid lines. Yet every attempt to trace where the women had been taken ended the same way, with missing coordinates, unsigned orders, and routes that led nowhere. It was as though the system itself was rejecting the idea that those prisoners had ever moved at all. Among the remaining POWs, fear deepened into something heavier. Women who had shared bunks and whispered reassurances at night now found empty spaces beside them, personal belongings left behind as silent proof that someone had been there only hours before. Some clutched their identification tags constantly, terrified that being uncounted even once could erase them. Others tried to memorize faces, names, and details, hoping that memory alone might serve as a record if the paperwork failed. Guards avoided eye contact, enforcing rules more harshly than before, as if discipline could suppress the growing sense that something was spiraling beyond their control. Inside higher command, the chaos took a different form. Conflicting intelligence reports suggested enemy units operating where none should exist, while intercepted communications hinted at operations that were never formally authorized. Requests for clarification disappeared into bureaucratic voids, returned weeks later stamped with vague phrases like "no further action required." At one point, an inspection team arrived unannounced, only to be redirected at the last moment due to a destroyed bridge that no one remembered being attacked. Every anomaly was explained away individually, yet together they formed a pattern that no one dared to name. The war was still raging, resources were stretched thin, and asking too many questions was beginning to look like a liability. For the women still in custody, the tension became unbearable. Nights stretched endlessly, punctuated by distant engines and the occasional flash of headlights beyond the wire. Every sound suggested another unmarked truck, another quiet separation. Rumors spread that some prisoners were being taken for intelligence purposes, others for labor, and still others for reasons no one could articulate. The uncertainty was its own form of punishment. And beneath it all lay a growing realization. Whatever force was moving these women through the shadows was operating faster than the war itself, adapting to chaos rather than being hindered by it. This wasn't the real problem yet. Something larger was forming, something that would soon make the disappearances impossible to ignore. By the time winter tightened its grip on the region, the system designed to track prisoners had effectively collapsed for a select few. Entire entries vanished from registries without explanation, pages torn cleanly from logbooks as if removed with purpose rather than haste. Clerks began keeping unofficial notes, names scribbled on scraps of paper, dates memorized instead of written down. But these too disappeared, confiscated or discarded during sudden inspections. One officer refused to authorize a transfer he could not verify and was reassigned within days, his replacement arriving with sealed orders and no interest in reopening unresolved cases. Another reportedly suffered a breakdown after claiming he recognized a woman he had previously processed walking under guard weeks later, despite her being officially listed as transferred out. Fragments of evidence surfaced only much later. Letters written by captured women but never sent, their ink faded but their urgency unmistakable. Diary entries that stopped mid-sentence, hidden inside clothing or luggage and overlooked during searches. One message, dated just days before the war ended in that sector, read simply that the promise of safety no longer meant anything and that registration had become more important than survival. These were not dramatic declarations, but quiet acknowledgments of fear, written by people who sensed that time was running out and that the system meant to protect them had turned dangerously indifferent. As Allied forces pushed forward and German command structures disintegrated, desperation took hold. Some women attempted escape during night movements, believing that the chaos of retreat offered their only chance. Gunshots were reported along remote roads, but no bodies were officially recovered. Others reportedly reached checkpoints manned by advancing troops, shouting names, units, and ranks, begging to be logged before being taken away again. Yet when those checkpoints were reviewed later, no corresponding entries could be found. It was as if the women had passed through a gap in reality itself, visible to witnesses but invisible to history. Then without warning the fighting stopped. Camps were liberated. Survivors were processed, interviewed, counted, and transported home. Lists of POWs were finalized, losses tallied, victories recorded. But dozens of female names remained unresolved, neither alive nor dead, neither released nor executed. No graves were found. No trials addressed their fate. The war, which had consumed millions of lives with brutal efficiency, ended without leaving space to ask what had happened to those who did not fit neatly into its records. And in that moment, as peace was declared and attention shifted forward, the disappearances slipped quietly into obscurity. In the years that followed the end of the war, the truth did not emerge in headlines or courtrooms, but in fragments, small, unsettling pieces scattered across archives, private collections, and testimonies given long after fear had hardened into something quieter and more permanent. There was no single moment of revelation, no document that suddenly explained what had happened to the women who vanished after capture. Instead, the story revealed itself the way ruins do when uncovered by time, slowly, unevenly, and never completely. One of the first pieces surfaced by accident. In the early 1960s, during the clearance of a long-abandoned storage facility near a former transit camp, workers discovered a battered suitcase sealed beneath debris. Inside were the expected remnants of wartime displacement, worn clothing, a cracked compact mirror, folded photographs. But hidden beneath a false lining was something else entirely: a diary. Its pages were thin, fragile, and densely written in pencil that had faded almost to nothing. The early entries were ordinary, describing marches, shortages, and the monotony of waiting. But toward the end, the tone shifted. Dates became inconsistent. Locations were mentioned that did not correspond to any known camp. Transfers were described that did not appear in any official records. The final pages spoke of repeated movements at night, of names being taken and erased, of assurances given and then quietly withdrawn. The last entry ended mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted and never allowed to return. Around the same time, a confidential memorandum surfaced within Red Cross files that had been quietly declassified without public notice. It referenced unresolved cases involving female prisoners of war, noting discrepancies between intake records and post-war repatriation lists. The language was cautious, almost evasive. Rather than calling for investigation, the document recommended no further inquiry, citing post-war sensitivities and the risk of reopening unresolved jurisdictional issues. There was no explanation of what those sensitivities were, nor why they applied only to certain cases. The memo was never circulated beyond a limited internal audience and was quietly archived, where it remained largely unnoticed for decades. Testimonies, when they came at all, were fragmented and reluctant. One woman, interviewed briefly in the 1970s by a regional historian, spoke of her time in custody only in vague terms. She recalled being moved repeatedly, often without explanation, and noticing that the uniforms worn by those giving orders did not always match known unit insignia. She described instructions delivered verbally, never written down, and transfers that seemed designed to leave no trace. When asked directly what happened to the women who disappeared, she fell silent. Moments later, she ended the interview, refused to sign the transcript, and declined all future contact. It was the only time she ever spoke publicly. As more fragments surfaced, historians began to notice a pattern, not of events but of absences. There was no centralized order authorizing the disappearances. No single chain of command could be traced from capture to vanishing. Instead, there were gaps, files that ended abruptly, logs with missing pages, transfers acknowledged verbally but never recorded. It was as though the system itself had been used to erase its own actions, relying on chaos, retreat, and the sheer scale of the war to conceal what could not be justified later. Debate followed, cautious and often muted. Some scholars suggested intelligence operations, arguing that certain women may have possessed information deemed too sensitive to risk repatriation. Others pointed to the collapse of command structures, suggesting that the disappearances were the result of uncoordinated decisions made in the final months of the war. Still others proposed something more deliberate, a shadow process operating alongside official channels, exploiting ambiguity and urgency to remove individuals without leaving evidence. Yet every theory encountered the same barrier. The records did not continue. They stopped exactly where answers should have begun. For families, the aftermath was measured not in theories, but in years of waiting. Some received official notices stating that their daughters were missing in action, the language carefully chosen to avoid certainty. Others received nothing at all, no confirmation of death, no proof of survival. Inquiries were met with form letters citing lost records, destroyed archives, or the administrative chaos of the war's final months. Hope faded unevenly, replaced by a kind of suspended grief that offered no closure. As decades passed, the war's narrative moved on. Histories were written, borders redrawn, victories catalogued. The missing women were rarely mentioned, their absence treated as an anomaly rather than a question. Requests to unseal remaining files were denied or returned heavily redacted, entire paragraphs blacked out, dates removed, names replaced with numbers. The justification was always the same: national security, diplomatic sensitivity, or the protection of individuals long deceased. Yet somewhere within those sealed archives lies the final accounting of what happened after surrender, what she saw when the trucks arrived, who gave the orders that never reached paper, and why safety was promised when disappearance was the outcome. The war recorded its battles with obsessive precision, but it failed to record what happened to her. And until those files are opened, the truth remains where it has always been, unspoken, unacknowledged, and waiting in the dark. As time moved forward, silence itself began to harden into policy. What had once been confusion or administrative neglect slowly transformed into something more deliberate, a refusal to reopen questions that no longer fit the post-war narrative. In the immediate years after the conflict, there had been little appetite for uncomfortable details. Nations were rebuilding, alliances were shifting, and the priority was stability, not accountability. Within that climate, unresolved cases, especially those involving women who existed at the margins of military hierarchy, were quietly set aside. Not denied, not explained, simply left untouched, as though attention alone might give them weight they were never meant to carry. Attempts at investigation did occur, but they rarely progressed far. In the late 1950s, a small internal review was initiated after inconsistencies were noticed between POW intake lists and repatriation records. The review stalled almost immediately. Key witnesses were unavailable, documents were missing, and responsibility was diffused across multiple commands that no longer existed. The final report concluded that the disappearances could not be conclusively explained due to wartime conditions and recommended no further action. It was filed, archived, and effectively buried. Those who tried to push beyond that conclusion often encountered subtle resistance. Researchers reported sudden denials of archive access, previously available files marked restricted, and correspondence that went unanswered. In some cases, permissions were revoked without explanation. There were no threats, no overt warnings, only closed doors and the steady implication that some questions were better left unasked. Over time, even the most persistent investigators learned to read the signals. Silence, they realized, was not accidental, it was maintained. Survivors carried that silence differently. Some avoided the subject entirely, refusing interviews or dismissing questions with practiced detachment. Others hinted at experiences they could not fully articulate, describing fear not just of what had happened, but of what would happen if they spoke openly. One former POW wrote in a private letter that survival came with conditions, even if those conditions were never stated aloud. Another noted that the war did not end for everyone in 1945. It simply became quieter. These were not dramatic accusations, but subdued acknowledgments of a reality that had followed them long after the fighting stopped. For families, the passage of time offered no relief. Parents grew old without answers. Siblings inherited unanswered questions alongside faded photographs and official notices that said nothing at all. Some families continued writing letters to military offices well into the 1970s, only to receive the same replies their parents had decades earlier. Others eventually stopped asking, not because they no longer cared, but because the act of hopping had become too painful. The absence of certainty froze their grief in place, leaving no room for mourning, only waiting. As historical memory solidified, the missing women slipped further into obscurity. Textbooks summarized campaigns and treaties, while footnotes absorbed the unresolved. The idea that individuals could vanish within systems designed to document everything was inconvenient, challenging the belief that modern war, however brutal, was at least traceable. Acknowledging their fate would have required confronting failures that extended beyond the battlefield, failures of oversight, of accountability, and of will. Today, the archives remain selectively sealed. Some files are still classified. Others are accessible only in fragments, stripped of names and context. Requests for transparency are met with explanations that grow thinner with each passing decade. Officials cite the protection of sources, diplomatic considerations, or the irrelevance of reopening old wounds. Yet the wounds persist precisely because they were never addressed. History, after all, does not forget what it chooses to ignore. It merely leaves the remembering to those without power. Somewhere within those locked collections is the final sequence of events. The moment after surrender, the arrival of the trucks, the verbal orders never committed to paper, the decision to move certain women outside the system entirely. It exists not as a single document, but as a convergence of fragments that, if assembled, would tell a story that does not fit neatly into victory or defeat, a story of promises made in chaos and broken in silence. The war prided itself on records, on numbers, maps, and meticulously kept logs. Battles were measured in meters gained and lost, lives reduced to statistics. Yet for these women, the machinery of documentation failed at the exact point it mattered most. They were captured, they were promised safety, and then they were erased, not only from rosters, but from the collective memory of the conflict. And so the story ends where it began, not with an answer but with an absence, a space in the record where a name should be, a pause in testimony where a truth should emerge. Until the archives open fully, if they ever do, the fate of these women remains suspended between history and silence, not officially lost, not officially found, just waiting as they have been for decades, in the dark space between what was recorded and what was allowed to disappear.